her connection's all okay. So will they leave her on for the whole time?
Yes.
Good afternoon. So we might get started so we can keep to time. I know it's a busy agenda this week. So great to see so many of you here for this session on Just Transition. And I hope you're enjoying the first day of the Asia-Pacific Social Protection Week. My name is Kate Hughes. I'm a Principal Climate Change Specialist in ADB's Climate Change team and one of the leads on Just Transition for ADB. In order for developing member countries to achieve their development goals, we know that climate change must be addressed and that this will need economies and societies to transition rapidly to net zero. And while climate action is often seen as a trade-off to economic development, it should be viewed as a significant economic opportunity for our region. But the speed and scale of the transformations needed are unprecedented and will be disruptive. These disruptions can be opportunities to create quality jobs, develop green industries, and bridge development gaps, such as gender inequality. But they also present socioeconomic risks that must be identified and managed. They could exacerbate pre-existing inequalities and disproportionately impact disadvantaged social groups and sectors. The Paris Agreement on Climate Change of 2015 recognised this risk and committed parties to taking into account the imperatives of a just transition of the workforce and the creation of decent work and quality jobs in accordance with nationally defined development priorities. Subsequent climate agreements, including the most recent one at COP27 last year, have reinforced this commitment. And we have seen a really rapid growth in engagement on the issue of just transition over the last 2 years. This has seen just transition being placed at the centre of climate initiatives, such as the Just Energy Transition Partnerships signed between the international partners groups and South Africa and Indonesia, with other countries under discussion. ADB committed to the joint MDB principles on just transition in November 2021. We also have a Just Transition support platform to provide technical assistance on strengthening institutional capacity of DMCs to implement Just Transition and develop Just Transition projects. We're also developing our Just Transition institutional approach, leveraging existing policies and processes. Just Transition is also an integral part of ADB's energy transition mechanism, and this is where we're at a really critical stage of translating high-level commitments into workable and practical approaches. While there's broad conceptual agreement on the need for a just transition, practical approaches, particularly in Asia and Pacific, are nascent. We know from many troubled transitions in the past that the transition will not happen in a just manner without intervention. So proactive efforts and enabling policies are needed to address potential labour market misalignments and distributional impacts, and to protect and reskill workers who lose their jobs. Even with robust policy frameworks and programs to aid this transition, there will be changes in the nature, location, and magnitude of demand for social protection. This will come at a time when governments are facing fiscal challenges associated with transition as industries, particularly fossil fuel industries, wind down, which will impact government royalties and tax revenue. This is also at a time of increasing borrowing cost and other fiscal pressures. Just transition needs a systematic approach that recognises how challenges are interconnected. Governments need support to understand and plan for a multidimensional issue that involves broad stakeholders, both within and outside government. And all of this must be predicated on a truly inclusive and participatory process. This requires collaboration between multiple stakeholders, and I'm so pleased to have expert panelists today who represent some of the key institutions working on this issue. We're looking forward to hearing your insights. Firstly, Christina with the keynote speech, followed by panelists' response and then discussion. There's also time for audience question and answer at the end, and I really strongly encourage you to participate and ask questions. So without further delay, let me please introduce you to Christina Dankmeyer, who's the advisor on Just Transition, Financing Initiative and Social Protection at GIZ. She's also formerly ILO's Social Protection and Climate Change Specialist. Over to you, Christina.
Thank you so much, and good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for having invited me to speak, not just on the panel, but also now the keynote. When we talk about a changing world, we often talk about the challenges that come with climate change. And we hope that with this session, we can actually focus a bit more on the opportunities of the process of transitioning to a climate resilient and decarbonized future to change people's lives for the better. And so when we first discussed this session, Kate said to me that now, as we have a solid common understanding of the conceptual side, what just transition means, we can focus on moving towards implementation. But with all things climate change, you can never be too sure. There is agreement, so we actually wanted to make sure that this overview includes a little bit of the conceptual side as well. So with the next slide, I would like to just briefly make sure we're all on the same page regarding the concept of just transition, since there is not necessarily an international agreed definition, but we will refer to the 2015 ILO Just Transition Guidelines, and as you can see, there are quite a few policy areas included in the concept of just transition as it is defined there, including social protection. And I think this is a really important point. Often when we talk about a just energy transition, it is not necessarily recognized that social protection is in fact required to achieve a just transition. And so the concept here talks about, not just minimizing emissions, but also minimizing the negative impacts on people and actually maximizing climate actions and opportunities for people. So maybe moving on relatively quickly to the role of social protection with the next slide. So obviously everybody in this room will know the core function of social protection, looking at preventing or reducing poverty and vulnerability. But it is also apparent that with increasing and more severe shocks and also longer-term stresses, we need to extend that function to also protect people from these shocks and stresses. So that's essentially where we are now. But there's also emerging evidence that especially social assistance programs, cash transfers, in some cases even without changes in their design, may, without even an explicit environmental objective, increase or have a direct effect on the beneficiaries' land use and conservation behaviors, and so support climate action in the long term. But for a transition to actually succeed for each and every one, people will not only need to adapt, and so adopt sustainable behaviors and practices and diversify their livelihoods and invest in more sustainable ones, but we also need to make sure that the arising negative impacts of climate policies that may come, for example, in terms of job losses, price increases, or also implications for income and consumption, will have to be cushioned to some extent. And people also will need social protection to actually get the resources and also have the time to further develop their skills and access new decent employment opportunities. And so I would focus on these three areas that you see on the right. So first of all, incentivizing sustainable behaviors and practices, compensating potential negative policy impacts, and also supporting labor market transitions. Starting with the last one, we can go to the next slide. So in countries that have already undergone major transitions, we, as for example, moving away from coal, we have seen big changes that occur in labor patterns, and also see significant misalignments in the labor market throughout the process, because jobs lost and also jobs created may not necessarily occur at the same time. They don't cluster in the same communities, regions, or countries, and they also affect different sectors of the economy. And also new jobs and sectors require different skills than existing ones in declining sectors. And so the measures that you see in the big figure here are not new by any stretch, but their integration will be particularly important given the extent of changes in a very short amount of time that we need, and significant educational and also sectoral requirements in the transition. And so this became quite clear in the example of the German transition away from coal, which Kate asked me to touch upon as well. Although the German system already covered a large proportion of the population through mandatory coverage, the just transition of coal miners in Germany and also coal miners' families was actually facilitated most notably by unemployment protection and pensions, and also social protection measures linked to skills development and employment services. And so that included, for example, addressing costs associated with vocational training for both employed and unemployed people, also supporting transportation, for example, offering job placement support through job centers and employment services generally free of charge. But also reimbursement of application costs, travel expenses, and also looking at new requalification measures, especially for older job seekers. And so you can already see that it's a very large package of different interventions that eventually has to come together to make this work. And maybe just a quick note that this doesn't just apply to the transition away from coal, but we've also seen in other countries. I see Australia here. We saw the example of the automotive industry structural adjustment process, which followed major plant closures. And there you see very similar needs and also demands from former workers and their families arising throughout this process. Now, moving on to cushioning the negative impacts of climate policy responses. So obviously there are many negative implications that can arise beyond just the labor market throughout this process. So we see price increases, not just in the context of carbon pricing or fossil fuel subsidy reform, but we may also see price increases because of investments in climate neutral or climate resilient infrastructure. There may be private investments needed, for example, in assets such as heat pumps, for example. And there may also be potentially costly changes for individuals in sustainable practices and behavior through also regulation. So for example, making deforestation illegal. And so here during this session, we'll just mainly focus on the higher cost of living, at least in the short term, even though that may balance out over time, and look at countries' measures that can address these. And so what we've seen recently is that countries often use price control measures, but are slowly now also increasingly moving towards income support measures to cushion different policy impacts. Price control measures, a very uncommon term for the social protection world, but it's essentially a broader term for controls that fix or cap the price of different products, reduction in taxes, fees, excises. So you may also refer to a lot of these measures as subsidies, and also rebates, for example, different discounts or exemptions as well. But what we see now is that countries, so we've seen in the context of recent price increases for other reasons, so also the Ukraine conflict, that countries have moved increasingly from price controls towards income support, finding that subsidies may not be quite so conducive to adjusting demand, may also weaken price signals, and may still cost a lot. And measures may not necessarily meet the needs of all those affected. So for example, in some countries, income tax reductions actually excluded large parts of the population, especially the informal economy. As we heard in previous sessions, that is an issue for many low and middle income countries. And so this leads us to transition-related support that potentially integrated in social protection systems actually allows for a more cost-effective and sustainable policy response, especially if prices actually remain at a higher level for a longer period of time. And so we now have a range of different design options, and some of them may actually be familiar to you already. So existing programs can actually be expanded to support an increased number of people. So we see that in this context as well. Portugal recently permanently updated its social support index by, I think, 8% last year, which is essentially the basis for its income support measures. And this change actually affected 1.2 million people in terms of existing beneficiaries, but also additional beneficiaries now being included in these support measures. But expanded social protection programs may not automatically account for the rather heterogeneous effect of price increases across households beyond income. So considering other factors, housing, household composition, access to affordable energy, energy efficiency measures, and public transport may be necessary to also include. And so certain supplements can actually be provided basically as top-ups, so to say, to existing measures to reduce the financial vulnerability of these households to higher costs of living. One example was Spain last year. They permanently increased their annual thermal social bonus to address energy poverty, which was essentially linked to their social bonus for low-income households, pensioners, disabilities, large families as well. So basically making sure that other factors beyond just income are actually taken into account when designing these measures. And then the same adjustments can be made to contributory schemes. So we can actually also consider top-ups, expansion, design tweaks, also in terms of reducing or temporarily suspending or postponing the payment of contributions, for example. So I think this is something that is often forgotten when we look at the ways to actually reach a larger number of people. And so there's a growing body of literature now also that looks at revenues from environmental policies that are actually better recycled, so to say, towards a reduction of social security contributions than, for example, using them to promote renewable energy or towards indirect or capital taxes. And so this is something to follow over the next months and years. I was gonna spend a little bit of time on design and practice in terms of promoting sustainable behaviors, but I think in the interest of time, I'll just move to financing so we can cover that as well. So climate change mitigation policies can actually generate fiscal space to complement existing social protection financing mechanisms, and actually in the process also help cushion the effects of climate change policy responses. And I think it's just important to consider it's definitely not a quick fix for social protection. Revenues are often relatively small, especially if we look at, for example, carbon pricing, to expand social protection significantly. But still, we need to figure out what the most effective use of these additional, even though limited, resources is for maximum gains for social protection. And so we recently commissioned a study with SASPRI actually to simulate, first of all, the impacts of selected climate change mitigation policies. So it looked at carbon pricing and fossil fuel subsidy reform, as well as which social protection reform options would be the most promising ones to actually address negative impacts on people. And so this was done for Indonesia, Vietnam, Ecuador, South Africa, Tanzania, and Zambia to get a relatively broad range of different countries. And the 3 reform scenarios for social protection considered were topping up existing benefits, expanding coverage to more people, and new introduction of categorical benefits. And it's interesting to see, I mean, first of all, it confirms all these reform scenarios would actually cushion the overall drop in mean income and consumption, more significantly at the bottom of the distribution, not with the same effects towards the top. In 3 countries, it actually, so looking at 3 countries in total, it actually showed that increasing the value of existing tax finance benefits leads to a more significant reduction of poverty. I think the 4th country was Indonesia, specifically focusing on the Family Hope program. That would also have that effect to increase the value. But we also saw that where we have already existing large coverage gaps, the same is not true. So here, the higher coverage scenario, for example, in South Africa and in Zambia, was actually much more promising in terms of reducing poverty. And then the final lesson was introducing categorical benefits for entire vulnerable groups has an impact on stabilizing income and consumption in most of those countries. But we also saw that categorical benefits for specific groups are rather a good option for countries where poverty is not concentrated at the bottom of the income consumption distribution. So for example, Tanzania and Zambia. And so maybe just to move to the last slide with one final, next slide. Yeah, with one final, there we go, one final message for reforms. Before we actually start this process of looking at different options, we need to know what the current social protection system looks like, because we see that the shortcomings of the existing system are actually amplified when introducing climate change mitigation measures and different transition policies. And so these shortcomings actually need to be considered when designing social protection for just transition reforms. And also, one note on countries with higher carbon footprints, they are in a much better situation because their potential revenue from, for example, carbon pricing would enable them much more to increase existing benefits and to broaden the coverage. So we also need to look at the international perspective in terms of financing for different countries. And I'll leave it at that, and we'll look at the outlook and the international commitments in the discussion. Thanks so much.
Thank you so much, Christina, and a really good way to set the scene for the session. So we do have one panelist joining us online because unfortunately she was unable to travel. So Suranjali is online. I'll just see if she can come up so she can join the session.
Hi, Kate.
Hi.
Online.
Good afternoon. Thanks for joining us. So we have 3 great panelists now to join Christina in the discussion. And I asked each of them to start off with 5 minutes of reflection or comment, I guess, on the topic of just transition. One of the things that we find is it's such a multidimensional issue that everyone comes from a different area of expertise, everyone comes with a different perspective, and how we try to bring them all together in terms of coordinated support for countries is one of the biggest challenges. So first we have Mizuho Okimoto-Kaewtathip, who's the regional team leader and advisor for inclusive growth in the Bangkok regional hub of the UNDP. So Mizuho, please go ahead first. Thank you.
Okay. So thank you. I was asked to reflect on what it takes to reorient social protection system in the context of just transition, and to reflect on a few examples from what UNDP does. And I think maybe just wanted to start off by, from UNDP's perspective, reorienting social protection in the context of just transition means enhancing people's resilience and also capabilities. So not just sort of protective, but transformative, and enhancing capabilities is a very important thrust in our approach. As you know, UNDP also has a number of climate and environmental projects that address the twin objective of sustainability and also reducing vulnerabilities. Just a few examples from this region. In China, we support equipping farmers with awareness and new skills to adopt alternative cultivation practices that rely on less pesticide. And that is also a contribution towards advancing the progress towards Montreal Protocol that seeks to support the reduction of use of chemicals that affect the ozone layer. And these so skills development and also trainings, they support multiplier effects on the people's socioeconomic aspects of families and the farmers, including improved income, but also that these cultivation practices are replicated across different families in the community. And also at the policy level, there are mechanisms to promote alternative cultivation practices. Indonesia, we support enhancing awareness and skills and also economic empowerment of women who work in the plastic and electronic waste recycling sector. And that really exposes them to hazardous chemicals, and also they are largely in the informal sector. And this includes also enhancing the understanding and implication of such waste on families' health, and also equal wage between men and women, so multiple aspects of enhancing socioeconomic well-being of the families. In the Philippines, this is a project that already completed, but we supported weather index-based insurance that also complements the traditional insurance, crop insurance mechanism. And this enabled rapid payments to register recipients, and so that enabled them to restart planting in the same cropping cycle when the natural disaster or extreme weather conditions affected them, and that prevented them from being indebted to buy seeds and fertilizers. We are also very strong on analytical aspects, and in India we supported the baseline analysis of socioeconomic situation of Safai Satis, who are waste pickers and also street sweepers, identifying what are the bottlenecks or the exclusion factors for social protection, including like identification cards, access to bank accounts, etc., and recommendations around strengthening the inclusion of these informal sector workers in the social protection system. We're also carrying out a number of analysis also in Bangladesh. Our colleagues are here in Pacific forthcoming. So just maybe to summarize, I think the renewed role of social protection from UNDP's angle is really addressing the new and concurrent socioeconomic and environmental challenges on poverty and inequality and social vulnerabilities, but also that these have implications, the implications of structural transformation, including low carbon, green, blue, and transition, intertwine with these new vulnerabilities, and that impact also on the labor market and people's vulnerabilities. So therefore, going back to the point about enhancing capabilities and capacities, the acquisition of new skills and technologies are very important to our approach, in particular to make sure that they form part of future employment profile and enhance the people's capacity to take advantage of these new job opportunities in the job market. And again, also through that, to develop the human and cognitive capital of the workers affected, but also of the families, including on the services like nutrition, etc., are all part of this capability building. And I think the final point is on our Leaving No One Behind agenda, that we consider these structural transformation, new forms of vulnerabilities have impact on different and diverse population groups, so the impact is not even, and therefore the social protection will need to consider how the impact of these changes and transition have impact on different population groups, from young to old, worker, women, and also informal sector workers, and also persons with disability. Maybe I'll stop here and turn back to Kate. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mizuho. And I think, your point about enhancing capability and approaching the support from that lens resonates with what both Christina and I mentioned about the opportunities of the transition. I think there's often a misconception that just transition is about a risk mitigation agenda and coming in to clean up or mitigate impacts once they've occurred. But what's really essential is that we see this perspective of early interventions to support people to upskill and harness those opportunities that there are. So now, Ippei, I'd like to turn to you and introduce Ippei Tsuruga, who's the Social Protection Program Manager for the Country Office for Indonesia and Timor-Leste for the ILO. The ILO is obviously one of the key stakeholders in the Just Transition agenda and came out with the first set of guidelines that many people follow. So Ippei, over to you. Thanks.
No, thank you very much. I hope the ILO can lead the discussions, of course, and I will do my best to bring the Indonesian case and some kind of Indonesian flavors, country flavors, to the discussion today. In my view, there are two major challenges that Indonesia will face in the coming maybe 20 years, 10 years. In the short run, as you probably know, Indonesia is a disaster-prone country. So it's, every year there are a lot of flood cases, landslide cases, and you can name any kinds of climate-related risks, and Indonesia is quite exposed to these kind of risks every year. So this is short-term challenges the countries need to deal with every year. In the long run, the government of Indonesia aims to retire coal-fired power plants to achieve net zero emission by 2060. So the government aims to close down the entire industries. So of course it is expected that there will be a lot of unemployed workers and then a lot of job creations in the new renewable energy industries. So there will be the transformation of jobs and workers and businesses from one sectors to the other sectors. This will happen in 10, 20 years' time. So what can social protection schemes do? There are a number of social insurance, social assistance schemes in place in Indonesia. For instance, if floods and landslides destroy the communities, workplaces, employment injury insurance schemes can possibly support employees. When they get injured in workplaces or die in workplaces, the employment injury insurance benefits will be paid to themselves as a disability benefits or survivors' benefits to widows and orphans. If injuries and a death take place outside of workplaces, pension can provide the disability benefits and the survivors' benefits. And these schemes cover 30 million Indonesian employees out of 50 million for employment injury insurance. and about 10 to 15 million workers are enrolled in the pension schemes. What the scheme, probably you may be interested more on unemployment insurance, role of the unemployment insurance scheme. The government of Indonesia started the implementation of unemployment insurance schemes last year. And that program provides 45% of income replacement up to 3 months after dismissal. And the following 3 months up to 6 months, 25% of previous income will be paid. So that scheme can certainly have potential to facilitate a transition in a just manner while searching for jobs. Unemployed workers can possibly have unemployment benefits and public employment supports from labor offices, including job matching services, job counseling services, and the referral to new employers for job opportunities, and then also access to reskilling, upskilling opportunities. So that the unemployment insurance benefits can be the entry point for accessing these services. But of course, Indonesia still has a lot of issues to be improved. For example, the unemployment insurance doesn't provide protections for workers whose contract is expired. But in practice, a majority of Indonesian workers work with a fixed-term contract. It means short-term contract or contract-based, not permanent contracts. And then by the labor law, employers are required to pay severance if they dismiss the workers. So in practice, what will happen is that employers will wait until the contract will be expired. And then unemployed workers will have no access to unemployment benefits as well because it doesn't provide coverage. So it needs to be improved. At the same time, micro-enterprises are not required to register their employees on a monetary basis. But as you can expect, a majority of enterprises in Indonesia are micro-enterprises. So extending legal coverage on a monetary basis to micro-enterprises can have a potential to increase the coverage to 15 million additional employees alone. Construction workers, there are 8 million workers that are enrolled in social security system, but they are not covered by the scheme. So legal coverage alone, extension of legal coverage alone have a huge potential to improve the protection. So I want to close it here, but the lessons from Indonesia can be that, as Christina mentioned, we need to look at individual schemes and contingency, climate risks, and what available schemes can do, and if not, some kind of specific schemes is needed to provide protections. Thank you.
Thank you, Ippei. And I think, you highlighted some of the twin challenges that we're facing, right, with increasing climate impacts, but also this need to rapidly transition whole sectors and industries. And it's the poor and vulnerable that suffer the most in both of those cases, right? And I think the other interesting point was your point on contracts. We find with some of the projects and programs that you're trying to pursue to encourage transition, you also want to make sure that you don't create the situation where there's misincentives for people to terminate contracts early or to wind down jobs in anticipation of something that's coming before it actually occurs. So we'll now turn to India, which is another country, obviously, that is very central to the discussion on just transition. And we're very fortunate to have Suranjali Tandon with us, who's the Associate Professor at the National Institute of Public Finance and Policy in New Delhi, and also a visiting Senior Research Fellow at the Grantham Research Institute at the London School of Economics and Political Science. And Suranjali has done a lot of work on the issue of just transition, and particularly on how we finance just transition. So over to you, please. Thank you.
Thank you, Kate. So just transition is a difficult topic for India because it involves talking about what will happen to coal or coal's future Over the last year and a half, there's been some increased receptiveness on the topic. We've seen that, the Apex think tank for India, which is the Niti Aayog, had earlier put out a report on the phase down plan for coal and what the just transition strategy should look like. We also see strategic partnerships being built along with multilateral organizations. So, for example, the Ministry of Coal is working with the World Bank on a just transition program, which is basically not just about transitioning away from fossil fuels and the big net zero plan, but also today India has mine closures which may not be managed well, and the experiences show us that there is loss of livelihood, there is a loss of jobs, and so that needs to be managed much better. So what we're seeing is there is now an increased understanding or interest in what just transition means. I'd like to talk about quickly the setting of the context in India and the dimensions that need to be thought through when talking about just transition. I think the first important one is the loss of revenues. So for a country where there is dependence on coal as well as other fossil fuels for not just national tax revenues but also subnational level, I think what we are expecting is that these revenues will decline. That automatically means that there is a reduction in fiscal space available to do what needs to be done on SDGs, which I think are linked to the core of what just transition entails. So today, just to give you a perspective, today about a fifth of the revenues for the government are from fossil fuels. So, just linking it back to the first presentation, the importance of designing new ways of raising revenues, whether this is through pricing, new taxes, that I think needs to be thought through, and it has to be calibrated. So that dimension needs to take care of the just transition angle. The other thing that I think is worth mentioning is the initial engagement in the private sector. So far, our understanding is the private sector does not move to sectors which may be aligned with just transition, which would mean that, they're focused around reskilling, around creation of new jobs. But what we're seeing, there are early signs of engagement with private sector. There are national level banks that have mutual funds. So for example, the State Bank of India, which has a mutual fund, which is engaging as an investor with companies in the hard-to-abate sectors to ask what their plan is in order to implement a just transition. So it's not about just going to net zero, but it's also about what you're going to do with your employees as well as your consumers. And we have the new reporting framework in place, which puts at its center consumer communities as well as employees. In the last year has also been, this year rather, has been rather interesting because you have the first sovereign green bond issuance by the government of India. And on the face of it, it looks like it's heavily focused on green, but if you go through the framework, it talks about a co-benefits approach. And I think the linking of what we do on climate action to the results that can be achieved in the social dimension is also something very important. We have the securities market regulator also talking about an expanded scope of bond issuances in India, which goes beyond green. So it talks about transition bond framework as well. And I think historically for India, we've used our banking sector, which still seems to be the main source of finance. We've used our banking sector to target our priorities. And through something called the priority sector lending. And what we are seeing is that, there are elements there, for example, lending to MSMEs, which are core or important to this transition through the value chains as well as through the employment dimension, which can be used. We can use banking finance as well to leverage a just transition. But just to put it all together, that there are financial innovations underway. But at the same time, there needs to be also focus on how we look at our fiscal strengths. And this is also important for multilateral organizations or lending organizations that board to a country like India. to carry out stress tests to fiscal position. And it's not just about raising revenues. I think some of the few states, for example, Odisha is a state which is disaster prone, has taken initiatives to map its budget to look at fiscal risks that can arise from such events. And I think that needs to be done across states that could be coal dependent or disaster prone, which multilateral organizations should look at while engaging with states on just transition. So I'll stop there. Thank you.
Thank you so much. And again, more interesting perspectives, I think, to bring to the discussion, particularly this point around loss of revenues. And one of the things that we've been looking at a lot at ADB is around this concept of direct, indirect, and then induced impacts associated with just transition. And, you know, often the way that things unfold in countries is project by project, and when you look at a single project or intervention, then you can understand the direct and potentially indirect impacts. But those induced impacts need someone to manage and monitor that at a more programmatic level, and that's actually where transitions have failed in the past once you look at those induced impacts. So we'll now move on to a panel discussion. I think there's lots of interesting points there to touch on again. So Ippei, maybe to you first. You mentioned some of the demands and I think some of the key changes happening in Indonesia that may impact on social protection. Are you already seeing an awareness of this emerging in Indonesia amongst government and other stakeholders? And or programs emerging to manage some of these issues?
I think yes and no. Yes part. I mean, no means people still have a challenge to understand what is social security and what will happen next for just transitions. But increasing number of media coverage and then workers' concern are a kind of phenomenon now, and what is very unique here is that the government decided to close one industry. So that is really kind of a unique phenomenon. And then that's probably, it can justify the government provide more subsidies or increase the non-contributory social security schemes to mitigate challenges. Such discussions going on, in my view. And also the government noticed that existing schemes alone cannot solve all the problems. For instance, unemployment benefit schemes cannot cover self-employed by design. So what can the government scheme provide supports to them? And also mobility allowances are currently not provided by unemployment benefit schemes. But once the one huge industry is retired or disappeared, of course the whole village and the community will probably have to move to the other places to find a job and raise families. But then, can the government provide any support through taxation, subsidies? The last but not least, by the labor law, employers are still required to pay severance if they dismiss the workers. But is it employers' liability to cover this, because the government is the one who decided, right, to exit one industries? So of course the government has some justifications. I'm not blaming them, but just providing some food for thought. Can the government support such, cover the employer's liability partially or temporarily? So there will be a lot of discussions, and then some of the government officials we are talking to may concern about these issues, and the workers and employers also concerned about these issues. So I think the ILO is in a good position to listen and continue discussion.
Thank you. And I think that's really one of the challenges, right? That the pressure is, huge pressure is on countries to increase climate commitments, to increase the speed at which you're transitioning, increase, the coverage of transition, but it raises these other challenges that the government really then has to take on, right, and absorb. Maybe to you, Christina, you gave some really interesting examples, I think, of some of the work you're doing in many countries. and returning a bit to this opportunity side that we talked about, what do you think opportunities to use social protection or those policies as an opportunity to encourage the transition?
Thanks so much. Yeah, I think, I mean, obviously there are two larger groups of people that we need to take into account. And what we see in a lot of the Just Transition partnership plans, implementation plans, is that they often focus on workers, in some cases workers and their families. But they don't necessarily look at the larger community around those workers, so basically people who are indirectly affected. And so I think we need to basically come up with different strategies for these different groups that are affected. And so on the one hand, I mean, we talked a lot about the different intervention sort of packages that are required to support the transition from one job to another to more sustainable livelihoods. But I think what is often forgotten is the large number of people that are indirectly affected that may either already live in poverty and not have a job, or may also be too young or too old to actually be part of the labor market. And so I think there it is even more important to actually work on the incentive side, so looking at sustainable behaviors, also to what extent or how energy is actually used or even accessed, what are the very specific needs of those groups. And so we've seen in quite a few countries some interesting approaches where specific existing benefits have already been used, so child or family benefits, for example, to then actually add different types of housing-related or energy efficiency-related measures to specifically target those groups and their specific also energy needs in the process. And I think in that sense, if you actually look at the existing structure of the social protection system, having different types of social protection measures addressing the needs of different groups, it's actually really important to work with those and to make sure that in the process you don't just look at the labor market transitions and you don't just look at income issues, but you actually look at the additional vulnerabilities that these different groups are facing.
Thanks, absolutely. And I think that leads really well into my next question, actually, because I think to understand all of these potential issues and target support and design support effectively needs upstream analytics and needs a lot of work. And Mizuho, you mentioned in your intervention that UNDP is doing some of this work on analytics. Maybe you could mention a little bit more about some of this analytical work, or where you see the need for support for analytical work to help countries with just transition.
Yes, and I think building on Christina's point also, I think the incentivization, and to me that also leads to sort of national ownership and also political will to make this change. So, I mean, certainly not a project, it's not a solution. So I think, these new sort of analytics around the new frontiers of social protection, what is around, mapping, what's out there. But I think, how do we actually build on them to address the new vulnerabilities would be particularly important. I think, and how that feeds also into the policy dialogues are very crucial, I think, at this point in time. And again, like UNDP certainly plays a role, but I think we do that together with the minds of the experts around the table. And I think we do that within the UN agency with IFIs, also with development partners to really explore these new opportunities. And I think there's certain streams of work that support this kind of sort of really collective knowledge. And I think one of them is the global accelerator that ILO, UNDP, UNICEF are leading at the global level as part of this Secretary General's High Impact Initiative. And it's, of course, very important for the Pathfinder countries to benefit from some of these resource mobilization opportunities and invest in research, invest in policy change, but I think it's a process of coming to a common understanding and how to bring these different partners and convening a dialogue with different partners, and I mean, from the perspectives of financing, from the perspective of labor market policies, but also social protection policies, and all those need to come together. So I think these, opportunities and work streams help partners to come together to bring the great minds together and generate knowledge and inform the policy dialogue. So, yeah.
Thank you, and absolutely that partnership is becoming even clearer the more complex, the more we get into the issue. Just going back to one of your points on resource mobilization, and I think Suranjali, you mentioned that that staggering figure of 1/5 of government revenue coming from fossil fuels. You also mentioned the importance of the private sector to potentially fill this financing gap. Are you finding in India that the private sector is aware of this issue of just transition? And are they engaged in, I think, potential opportunities for private sector financing?
Yes, Kate, I think there's a growing acknowledgement of the incidence of the transition. Of course, to the public budgets, it's more palpable. In terms of how it translates into private sector responding, it's a few companies at the moment who are in the hard-to-abate sectors who are beginning to have this conversation. So, for example, these would be members of Climate Action 100 plus that are being asked questions by investors on what they intend to do in terms of reskilling of their employees, as well as their own overall transition plans. But I think in terms of funding, we're also seeing interesting public-private partnerships. So, for example, you have the Skill Development Council in India, which is forming alliances with the private sector to raise money to skill people, not just in sectors which are aligned with green transition, but overall there's a plan. There is across the state partnerships. So if you look at states where they are targeting, also include states that will be affected by this transition. So just to mention that, while I talk about 1/5 of the revenues coming from fossil fuels, there are some states, about 4 to 5 states, which are even more heavily dependent because of these mining as well as resource endowment being located in those states. So there is some thinking. I think private sector is beginning to engage more on what it means in terms of these states having their own plans for transition. So there is some talk around it. I think the other source of finance, which is quite interesting, is the corporate social responsibility funding, which is mandated for India. So 2% of the average profits in the last 3 years have to be put into sectors that have been predefined or identified. And I think there's great scope to scale that up. There have also been fiscal innovations in the past. So, for example, there's something called the District Mineral Fund, which is put aside through as a proportion of royalties that are earned or paid from mining. And what we've seen in the past is that these have remained unutilized. And now there is effort to use that alongside private capital that might be available in order to scale efforts to rescale to support communities. I think the last one that I've already mentioned is the sovereign green bond issuance. I mean, I'm conscious of the fact that states have their fiscal rules to adhere to, but there is interest even at the municipal level. So we always talk about, national governments or even sub-national, but this is the lowest tier of government. So there are municipal governments that are now issuing green bonds and are looking at transition bonds to support the local economy as well as, the job opportunities or communities. So I think there are several examples in India that have the potential to be used for scaling up of finance.
Thank you so much. I want to make sure we leave some time for audience questions, but I think there's one point we didn't touch on, which even Suranjali mentioned, these different levels of government, and that's governance around just transition. And I know, Christina, that's an area that you've looked at a lot. Maybe you can just provide some quick comments on the issue of governance and maybe the challenges associated with it.
I just have one quick addition, actually, to what Suranjali just said in terms of financing. And it just, a number just popped into my head, because we actually need to remember that last year, I think we reached a record of about, I think, 7 trillion a year spent on fossil fuel subsidies, in a world where the year before, countries had actually committed to phasing out at least inefficient fossil fuel subsidies. And I mean, obviously not all of those 7 trillion are actually direct fossil fuel subsidies. I think that's only about 600 billion, but still that number is awfully close to what we would need to actually cover social protection floors globally. And so I don't want to say, you know, we should be phasing out all those subsidies and spend all of that on social protection floors, because that's very context specific, what is actually needed in different countries. But I think sometimes we also have to remind ourselves that there is actually a lot of money out there being spent right now that we can also use differently. Yeah, just one quick thought on governance. I think it's really interesting when you look at countries that have already undergone major transitions. In many of those places, you start with a national level just transition strategy. In many countries globally, I think about 50 at this point, have already either started working on it, have developed it, or have committed to doing so. But the difficult thing is, I think, when looking at governance mechanisms throughout the transition, I mean, you obviously have many sectors involved. You need to develop different sector-specific just transition plans that actually align with those national strategies, but not enough. In many countries, you also have very decentralized systems. And an example that came to mind, actually, that I thought was quite interesting was Spain, which developed regional level agreements across different government sectors, also with employers and employees. So I bet the ILO would be interested in that example, to basically negotiate what is actually needed for implementation at regional level. And so I think that is a very good example to break it down even further and actually look at implications for specific regions, because especially in countries that are very decentralized, also looking at places like Indonesia, for example, with many different islands, I think those region-specific approaches are really important. And so getting different levels of government involved also even in that early formulation phase is really important.
Yeah, thank you. And I think, you know, where institutions like ADB can support is on, you know, regional economic diversification, right? And looking at those potentially vulnerable regions and that concept of early interventions for support. So we have about 8 minutes left, I think. So we have quite a big audience here. Over to you. We would welcome any questions. I think there's a roving microphone at the back if anyone would like to ask a question.
Sure. Maybe I'll start with a question. Most of the typologies on climate response we look at use the conventional mitigation and adaptation model. Occasionally you see some referred to dual action, but it's typically a very tiny percentage of the total. And if we look at short to medium term responses, you know, responding to a climate shock, you need adaptation. If you're dealing with closing down a coal-fired power plant, you need retraining and really clear mitigation measures. But if you take a few steps or maybe a few kilometers back and have a very long planning horizon, and we know climate change is a very long-term proposition, is anybody looking at the very long-term investments that are dual action, expanding inclusive digital technologies, investing in the kind of human and cognitive capital that build a more resilient future labor force, These seem to have really high returns, but they're also dual action. A smart economy is both a resilient economy and an economy that can roll with the punches that disruptions from climate change mitigation will bring. Who's doing the work on this long-term planning?
Thank you. It's an excellent question. Maybe I'll make a quick comment and then pass to my panelists. So I think one of the key changes that we've seen that will support that work is that originally climate policies and nationally determined contributions, which were shorter term plans, sat very much within the Ministry of Environment, and they were seen as environmental policies and also often seen as external to respond to an external UNFCCC process. We're now seeing a much greater shift where climate change is moving across to also be within ministries of economy, ministries of planning, ministries of finance. And with that, you get a much greater integration of the issues of long-term climate planning with long-term development planning. And along with that long-term strategies work, you are starting to see a more convergence where long-term resilience pathways are being done integrated with long-term decarbonisation pathways. There's still a split, but I think that cross-government involvement is one of the really critical levers to help to bring that together, and also to stop looking at climate change as an isolated agenda, but more as a national development agenda. So other key agendas such as digitalization, how do they interact and how do you bring that together as part of a policy or programming approach? Any of the other panelists like to comment on that question?
Yeah, just a quick note on it. Who is looking at it, or rather who should be looking at it, I think are two different questions, or rather answers. I think the should part refers to essentially all of us, because I think also the social protection community needs to look at this. Specifically when we look at financing also on the contributory side of things, we need actuaries to actually look at what does the financing side do over the next 5 to 10 to 50 years. To what extent can people actually continue to contribute, or will increasing numbers and higher severity of shocks actually make it impossible for people to contribute on a regular basis? And so even the existing contributory structures that we have, and obviously even more uncertainty also on the tax finance side. And so I think the short answer to that one is I think all of us need to be looking at this. The interesting thing is that the climate community is already looking at climate action as a more integrated concept now. So you see less of a division between adaptation and mitigation in recent discussions, also in the way the IPCC reports are now being discussed. There was a very interesting concept floating around at the last COP27 that people were all of a sudden talking about just resilience, because we also need a just process on the adaptation side. And a lot of people were then very quickly saying, this is nonsense, because just transition also needs to include climate change adaptation, because we all need to adapt no matter what we do at this point. Adaptation will be essential. Also for a just transition to succeed. And so eventually at this point, we know that we need to be looking at both in an integrated way. And so I hope at the discussion today we touched upon both adaptation and mitigation enough to make that clear. But
maybe I can make one. Yeah, maybe I make really quick 2 points. The government of Indonesia has the investment strategies in renewable energy or just energy transitions, and it's available online. So they have a long-term strategy how they are going to invest in. And then also the government aims to digitalize all the government services. I don't know how it will work. That's in the long-term development plan. And last but not least, as we are coming from social security backgrounds, one of the I think missing elements in the usual discussion is that investment of social insurance fund. Usually the pension fund is huge, like billions of dollars is staying there. But what is the investment policy of pension fund in each country? Provident fund, or any countries have any kinds of pension funds. But if we look at how they invest, what investment portfolio, probably we are not aware of that in detail. But probably that's one point I want to make.
Thank you. I'm conscious of the time. I think we could have this discussion for a long time. Were there any other audience questions? Please.
Hi, good afternoon. This is Farzana Reza from ILO Country Office, Bangladesh. Though it's quite a question about the coordination, because I have seen the panelist and moderator, it is the combination of the development partners and the UN agencies as well. So far, I am from Bangladesh. It's not from ILO perspective, but there is whatever in the first session we said that the social protection, then the just transition. We have very technical terminologies. So the question is around a country like Bangladesh, where we have a huge informal sector around the 84%, and the formal sector only at 16 to 15%. So from the regional perspective, what you are making strategy, not only the ILO, the all agencies to more focused on like country like Bangladesh, who are lag behind to addressing all the just transition and the social protection, because in our country, we have almost 116 social security programs, which is tax financed. But now ILO is with the other UN agencies, the UNDP, UNICEF, we are working for the social insurance and the active labor market policies. But again, we have another one, the just transition. So the main question is what is the regional, like you have so many strategy, the development. So the focused on the Bangladesh to mitigate the social protection and as well the just transition. So yes, thank you.
Thank you. I don't know, Mizuho, can you speak on Bangladesh or maybe some of the programs from UNDP's angle? Not to put you on the spot, but otherwise, Christina.
Sure. I mean, it is a little difficult because I'm not very familiar with the context specifically, but I think an earlier session actually touched upon the language, right, and how we actually talk in very technical terms and concepts that are not familiar, other people are not familiar with. And so I think we need to essentially break it down to what matters to individual people. So what can we do for the individual, for their livelihood perspective to be more sustainable, so that they don't just have food and an income today, but also tomorrow, to kind of make that very clear why it's actually important to invest in a more sustainable livelihood opportunity today. And we also need to make sure that different basic needs, so also including energy needs, are actually met, and that the right option or solution for people is actually also the cheapest one. And I think that's a really key question. As soon as people don't actually have access to affordable energy, they're going to, use whatever coping mechanism there is, even though it may be harmful for the climate. But I think in a lot of economies, you already see that shift happening, where the quote-unquote right option for people is actually increasingly becoming cheaper. And I think that's also where government investments need to come in, on the one hand, to support people's income in the process of getting there, until it's actually the cheaper option for people to do the right thing. And it's also the more sustainable option for them in terms of their future perspective to do the right thing for the climate.
Thank you. And maybe just 2 points to add on that. I think one of, when I mentioned right at the beginning about experience and practical application around a concept like just transition, and a lot of the experience that we see are in Europe, in Spain, Western Balkans, Germany, and this issue of the informal sector and the level of informality is different to the Asia-Pacific region. And so for ADB and partners working in the region, how we actually get regional specific and regionally appropriate responses on just transition is one of the critical issues. I think one of the other positive things today is that we haven't only spoken about the energy sector, and maybe that's because these stakeholders here come from the social side. If you go on the just transition discussion from the climate side, there's often so much focus on the energy sector, but other key sectors, particularly agriculture, for countries like Bangladesh, are so critical for transition, and how we manage a just transition approach in those sectors will also be really important. So trying as practitioners to push the discussion out from only an energy transition discussion is also a really critical part, and one key part of the work that ADB is doing under its Just Transition program. So unfortunately, we're actually already 4 minutes over time for this session. So I think just a very, very quick wrap up to say a huge thank you to all of the panelists. I think it's been a really interesting discussion. As is the challenge with the topic of just transition, it's very complex and multidimensional. We've touched on far too many issues to sum them up. But I hope that you've enjoyed the discussion, and I'm sure all of the panelists, as I, are happy to engage further in more detailed conversations. So I wish you well for the rest of Asia-Pacific Social Protection Week. Thanks very much. And thank you, Suranjali, as well.